Rain had been falling on Highway 2 east of Havre, Montana since before dawn, and by the time Gideon Cross spotted the sedan, it was nearly noon, and the pavement was the color of pewter. The car was doing 19 miles an hour in the right lane with its left blinker on, and had been for at least a mile. In the truck bed behind him, Boone, 65 pounds of dark brindle Dutch Shepherd, was already standing, already facing forward, ears pitched like antennae toward the sedan ahead. Gideon pulled alongside at first, then passed and looked into the rain-fogged driver's window, and what he saw made him pull the truck to the shoulder and get out before he had fully decided to. What Gideon Cross and his dog uncovered on that stretch of wet highway would unseal a secret that the town of Chinook, Montana had been sitting on for 2 years without knowing it. If you're new here, stay with me through this one and subscribe before you go. This is exactly the kind of story this channel tells, and you'll want to be here for what comes next. Gideon had joined the Marines at 21, which was later than most. He had spent 2 years at a community college in Great Falls studying general coursework without a declared direction, working a night shift at a distribution warehouse, and trying to figure out what kind of man he wanted to be when the particular pressure of being young and unmoored finally let up. It didn't let up. He enlisted because a recruiter came to the college job fair and said something that wasn't a pitch. Said it the way a man says a true thing when he's stopped caring whether or not it lands. And what he said was, the military won't tell you who you are, but it'll put you in enough situations that you'll figure it out yourself. Gideon had thought about that for 3 weeks. Then he signed. 3 years in. 1 deployment to Okinawa, 1 to the eastern Horn of Africa, which was quieter than people imagined it, and occasionally much less quiet than that, in ways he did not describe to anyone outside the people who had been there. He came back to Montana with his discharge papers and a particular clarity about what he valued that he hadn't had at 21. He also came back with a weight he hadn't had at 21, and that weight lived somewhere between his shoulder blades and didn't have a name and didn't leave when he slept, and sometimes made ordinary things. A crowded grocery store, a loud restaurant, a conversation that went on past the point he could locate the exit, feel like more than they were. He drove now. He did landscape and property work through the spring and summer, and in the shoulder seasons he drove. The High Line, the Sweetgrass Hills, the long empty stretches of Route 2, where the horizon was far enough away that a man could breathe without calculating. Boone had come from a trainer in Billings 18 months ago. He was not Gideon's first choice. Gideon had gone in thinking he wanted something smaller, calmer, a dog for the cab and the campsite. Then Boone had been brought out and had done something unremarkable. He had walked directly to Gideon, sat down beside him, and leaned his flank against Gideon's leg without invitation. The trainer said that didn't happen often. Gideon said he'd take him. Boone rode in the truck bed in fair weather and in the extended cab when it rained, and he had a particular sensitivity to changes in air pressure, not just weather, but the smaller kind, the kind inside a cab when Gideon's thoughts went somewhere difficult. And in those moments, Boone would place his muzzle on Gideon's shoulder from the back seat, without being asked, and simply stay there. Gideon had stopped trying to explain this to people who asked. He had started simply saying, "He's good company." That covered it. Walter Ennis had turned 91 in August. He had lived his entire life in a 30-mile radius of Chinook, Montana, which sat along the Milk River in the high plains of the north, and had a grain elevator you could see from a long distance in any direction, and a main street of 7 blocks and a Methodist church on the east, and that had been holding services in the same building since 1912. Walter had farmed dryland wheat for 54 years, his father's land, then his own, then shared with his son Gerald for a decade before Gerald moved his family to Spokane for a job in aerospace manufacturing. And the farming was contracted out to a neighbor named Dale Prentice, who worked it honestly and paid the lease on time. Walter had not complained about any of this. He understood that the land had to work and that the only question was who worked it. His wife, Norma, had died in the spring of 2019. They had been married 66 years. He had taken her to the same diner in Havre every anniversary, 66 consecutive years, without exception, through blizzards and harvest crunches, and one year when he had a broken hand and drove the 30 miles to Havre and back one-handed because it was their anniversary, and that was simply what you did. After she died, he drove to the diner alone on their anniversary date. He sat at their table. He ordered her usual, he ate it, He drove home. He had done it twice now. He still set her place at the table every morning. He still bought the brand of tea she preferred, even though he did not drink tea. On certain mornings, particularly mornings in early March when the light came low across the kitchen, and the house smelled of nothing that was not himself, the weight of the silence was such that he would stand at the kitchen window for 20 minutes before he could remember what he had meant to do next. Gerald called on Sundays. He called with the regularity and the duration of a man who was managing a checklist. 12 minutes, the same questions in roughly the same order, and a warmth that was real but abbreviated by distance and by the particular guilt that comes from having chosen, for good reasons, not to be there. Gerald was not a bad son. He was a son who lived in Spokane and had a career and 2 children, and had made the calculation that his father was capable, and his father had neighbors, and his father did not complain. All of those things were true. They were not the whole truth. The whole truth was that on the second Tuesday in November, Walter Ennis had driven into Havre for his twice-monthly grocery run and had turned around to come home and had, for the first time in 91 years of navigating the roads he knew the way other men knew their own names, become uncertain. Not lost in the dramatic sense, just uncertain. The road looked slightly different than he remembered, then slightly more different. He had turned where he thought the turn was, and the road he was on was not the road he expected. He had driven slowly while he tried to locate himself. He had driven slowly for a very long time. His phone was in the left pocket of his jacket, which was hanging on the hook by the kitchen door, back at the house. He had not needed his phone in 30 miles for 70 years. The habit of taking it had not yet fully taken. He was not frightened. Walter Ennis was not the kind of man who frightened easily. But he was tired. He had been driving since 9 in the morning, and the dashboard clock said 11:47, and the rain was reducing his visibility, and the blinker had been ticking so long he had stopped hearing it. Gideon's boots hit the wet shoulder, and Boone was over the side of the truck bed before Gideon reached the sedan's driver's window. He came around to the driver's side in the rain and tapped the glass with 2 knuckles. The window came down about 6 inches. The man inside was thin through the shoulders, white-haired, wearing a canvas work coat that had been good quality once and was now the kind of well-worn that takes decades to achieve. He looked at Gideon with eyes that were clear and calm, and that had behind the calm a kind of careful attention. The look of a man taking his bearings. "Everything all right, sir?" Gideon said. "Just a moment," the man said in the tone of someone consulting an internal map. "I believe I've gone slightly wrong somewhere." "How long have you been on this road?" A pause. "A real one?" "That's a fair question," he said. Boone had come around the front of the sedan and was sitting in the rain on the passenger side of the car, looking through the window at the man inside. Not alarmed, not alert in the tactical sense. Something softer, a specific attention, the kind Gideon had seen from him before in exactly one other circumstance, which was when Gideon's own weight got loudest at 2 in the morning, and the dog would come and simply be there. Gideon asked if he could get in out of the rain. The man, who gave his name as Walter Ennis, from Chinook, said so matter-of-factly, the way a man gives his name when he has never once been ashamed of it, said yes, by all means. Gideon got in on the passenger side. He asked Walter what he had set out to do that morning. Walter told him, groceries, Havre, twice a month, always a Tuesday. He described the route in detail and with perfect accuracy. He simply could not locate, at this moment, the point where things had gone sideways. He described this without distress. He described it with the frustration of a craftsman who has made an error he understands and cannot yet locate. Gideon looked at the back seat, a single paper bag of groceries. In the bag, visible at the top, a box of the brand of tea his wife had preferred. Gideon did not know this. He saw it and noted it. He would understand it later. "When did you last eat?" Gideon said. Walter considered this. "Breakfast," he said. Then, "Yesterday." There was no complaint in it. It was simply accounting. Gideon sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "There's a diner about 4 miles back east. Why don't we go there and get warm? Then we'll sort out where you're headed." Walter looked at the road ahead for a moment. Then he said, "That's sensible," the word he chose, "not grateful." Gideon understood the distinction perfectly, Have you ever known someone too proud to name what they needed? Someone who could be turned around on a highway in the rain for 2 days before they'd call it lost. If that person is still in your life, check on them after this. And if they're not, tell me about them in the comments. They deserve to be remembered. The diner was called Birdie's. It had been there since 1978 and had the kind of interior that didn't update itself on any schedule. Formica and vinyl and a pie case and a woman named Carla behind the counter who had seen everything and was untroubled by most of it. Gideon pulled Walter's sedan into the lot. Boone rode in the back seat of the sedan for the 4 miles, and by the time they parked, Walter had his hand resting on the dog's head the way a man reaches for something familiar. Carla brought soup without being asked, because it was that kind of weather, and Walter was that kind of age and she had been reading rooms for 30 years. Gideon ordered coffee. He asked Walter questions the way he had learned to ask them. Oblique, patient, not pressing toward an answer but leaving space for one. Walter talked. He talked about Norma. He talked about the farm. He described the wheat harvest the year they'd had 6 straight weeks of dry heat and lost 30% of the yield and still managed to make the mortgage payment, barely, and how he had sat at the kitchen table that night after the children were in bed and looked at the number and then closed the ledger and gone to sleep, because there was no use looking at it longer. He talked about Gerald, not with bitterness, with the plainness of a man who has made peace with the shape of things. He mentioned twice in passing a man named Roy Granger. Gideon nodded the name without flagging it. The second time Walter mentioned him, something changed slightly in how he sat. A tightening, a small withdrawal, as though he had brushed against something he'd prefer not to handle. While Walter was in the restroom, Gideon stepped outside with his phone and called the Blaine County Sheriff's non-emergency line. He gave Walter's name and a general description and said he had an elderly man who appeared to have been driving without rest or food for approximately 2 days and wasn't certain where he lived. The dispatcher said there was a missing persons check on a Walter Ennis out of Chinook, filed that morning, filed by a neighbor named Pearl Hutchins, who had gone to bring Walter his mail and found the house unlocked and the kitchen light on, and no sign of him. Not by Gerald, by Pearl Hutchins, the neighbor who had noticed. The dispatcher asked if Walter was in need of medical attention. Gideon looked through the diner window at the old man returning from the restroom, straightening his canvas coat with a particular dignity, nodding at Carla as he passed. "He needs lunch," Gideon said. "I'll stay with him." He called Gerald's number next. He'd gotten it from the dispatcher. Gerald answered on the 3rd ring with the slightly distracted tone of a man taking a call during a workday. Gideon told him what had happened in the simplest possible terms. There was a silence on the other end. "He didn't tell me he was having trouble," Gerald said. "He probably doesn't think of it as trouble," Gideon said. "He thinks of it as a navigation error." Another silence. Then Gerald said he'd come up from Spokane. Gideon said that was good. Then Gerald said, "I'll need to talk to Roy about the arrangement when I get there." Gideon said, "Who is Roy?" What he learned over the next 20 minutes, from Gerald, and then from a deputy named Taft who came into Birdie's in a county vehicle and sat with them and had a cup of coffee and a way of talking that put Walter at ease without condescension, came in layers. Roy Granger was 62 years old. He lived 4 miles from the Ennis property on a parcel that abutted the western fence line. He was a man who had done well by doing the kind of things that look, from a distance, like helping. He had introduced himself to Walter 2 years ago, shortly after Norma died, and had made himself useful in the early months, showing up for things, offering things, being present in a way that Walter, in his grief and his pride, had read as neighborliness, and that Gerald, at a distance, had read as reassurance. What Roy Granger had actually been doing in 18 months of steady and patient work was preparing a land agreement, a grazing lease with an option to purchase clause embedded in page 3 of a 4-page document that he had presented to Walter 6 months ago as a routine update to the property arrangement that Walter had not fully understood to be different from the existing lease. Walter had signed it. Of course he had signed it. He trusted his own judgment of people. He had not yet had a reason to distrust Roy Granger. The option price was 60% of assessed value. The window was 14 months from signature. 11 months remained. Deputy Taft made a phone call. He came back to the table and said, "Roy knows Walter's been found. He's on his way here." Boone, who had been lying under the table with his chin on Walter's boot, lifted his head. Roy Granger arrived at Birdie's 18 minutes later. He came through the door with the posture of a man who had thought about what he wanted to say on the drive over and was ready to say it. He was broad, rangy, wearing a ranch coat with the collar up. He looked at the table. Walter, Gideon, Deputy Taft, and Carla, who had not gone back behind the counter, and took the measure of it in about 3 seconds. Boone came out from under the table. He did not bark. The sound that came from him was low and continuous, the kind that operates below the frequency of alarm and above the frequency of anything comfortable. A sound that meant he had already made his assessment and was simply announcing it. He positioned himself between Roy Granger and Walter Ennis and did not move. When Roy took one step toward the table, Boone moved one step forward. Roy stopped. Boone did not. Roy looked at Gideon. "That dog under control?" "He's fine," Gideon said. "Sit down." Roy sat at the far end of the table, one seat removed. He arranged his face into something concerned and neighborly. He said he'd been worried sick. He said Walter had been disoriented lately. He used that word, disoriented, in a way that was meant to explain everything, and that he'd been doing his best to keep an eye on things. As a neighbor, because that's what neighbors did in this part of the country. And he hoped Gerald understood when he got there that the situation was being managed, and that there was already an arrangement in place for the property that would ensure stability and… Walter spoke. He had been quiet through all of it. He had eaten his soup. He had sat with his hands around his coffee cup and listened with the steady attention of a man who has been listening to other people talk for 91 years and has learned which kind of talking to trust. "I didn't know it meant he could buy it." 6 words, said quietly, without accusation, stated the way a man states something he has understood for some time and is only now allowing to leave the room it has been living in. Roy's neighborly expression did not change immediately, but something behind it did. He looked at Walter, and then he looked at Deputy Taft, and he understood that the sentence had just done what it had done, had named in front of a deputy and a stranger and a woman who had run a diner for 30 years, the exact center of the thing. Gideon looked at Roy Granger the way he had learned to look at men who had made a calculation and were now watching it fail. His voice was level. "Gerald is driving up from Spokane. The document has been photographed and sent to the county attorney's office. There's a question about whether the option clause meets the disclosure requirements under Montana's agricultural land transaction statute. Deputy Taft can speak to that better than I can." He paused. "Roy, you've been driving past this man's house for 2 years. You've been inside it. You know he signed that paper in a season when he was grieving his wife." Another pause. "You know that." Roy said nothing. Boone had not moved from his position between Roy and Walter. He watched Roy Granger for the duration of the silence. When Roy finally pushed back his chair and stood, the dog watched him stand. He watched him put on his coat. He watched him walk to the door. He did not relax. Not the set of his shoulders, not the low-maintenance hum, until the door of Birdie's closed behind Roy Granger and the sound of a truck engine started in the lot and moved away. Then Boone walked back to Walter and put his head on the old man's knee. Walter rested his hand on the dog's head. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "He must have thought I was further gone than I am." "He was wrong," Gideon said. "Yes," Walter said. "He was, if you had been sitting at that table in Birdie's, if you had heard those 6 words from a 91-year-old man who still set 2 places at his kitchen table every morning. Would you have stayed? Type yes or no below. I read every comment. The Montana County Attorney's Office opened a review of the option agreement within 2 weeks of Deputy Taft's report. The review found that the clause had not been presented with the disclosure language required under state statute for agricultural property transactions, a finding that effectively voided the option. The document was referred for further review. Roy Granger retained a lawyer in Havre. The matter was not resolved in an afternoon. It was resolved over 4 months in the deliberate way that these things resolve when they are handled correctly, and the resolution was that Walter Ennis owned his land, all of it, in the same condition he had always owned it. Gerald arrived the evening of the day Walter was found. He drove 9 hours from Spokane without stopping. He walked into the county guest cabin where Walter was resting and sat down beside his father and did not say anything for a while. Walter said, "You didn't have to come all this way." Gerald said, "Yes, I did." That was the whole conversation. It was enough. Gerald stayed for 2 weeks. He sat through the meeting with the county attorney and the calls with the Agricultural Extension Office and the renegotiation of the lease with Dale Prentice, who had worked the land honestly and was glad to have things clarified. Before he went back to Spokane, he arranged for a woman named Joan Pfeiffer from Chinook to come 4 mornings a week. Joan had grown up on a farm 3 miles from the Ennis property and understood without being told how to offer help to a man of Walter's temperament without making it feel like what it was. She called it company. Walter did not argue with the word. Pearl Hutchins brought a casserole the Friday after Walter came home. She set it on the counter, said she'd made too much, said Walter should eat it before it got old. He thanked her. She had known him for 40 years. She had noticed when his truck wasn't in the drive on a Tuesday night. That noticing had mattered more than anyone had said out loud. The Methodist Church on the east end of Chinook held its Thanksgiving service the following week. Walter sat in the third pew, where he had sat for 40 years. The pew to his left was empty, as it had been for 2 years, and he allowed it to be empty. Pastor Wren said something in her homily about the invisible thread of attention between neighbors, about how a truck missing from a driveway becomes a call, becomes a report, becomes a young man pulling over on a wet highway. In the rain, she did not name anyone. She did not need to. Gideon came back in December. Walter had told him at Bertie's about the anniversary diner, 66 years without exception, and then twice more alone. And Gideon had thought about it for 3 weeks, and then driven up from Havre on a Saturday with nothing in particular to say. Walter was in the kitchen. There was coffee. There was the quiet that a farmhouse has in December, when the fields are covered and there is nowhere to be. Boone went directly to Walter's chair and sat beside it, the way he sat beside Gideon's chair at 2 a.m. Walter looked at the dog for a moment. Then he put his hand on the dog's head. He did not make any comment about it. He poured the coffee. They sat for 2 hours. They talked about the land mostly, the way dry land wheat behaves in a wet year versus a dry one, the particular quality of the light in the high line in January, things that didn't need to go anywhere to be worth saying. When Gideon stood to leave, Walter walked him to the door. He looked at Boone, who was at Gideon's heel. "That's a fine dog," he said. It was not a small thing coming from him. "I know," Gideon said. He drove back to Havre in the dark with the heater running. Boone rode in the passenger seat because the temperature was down near 0, and the truck bed was no place for a dog when the air had teeth. They were quiet together the way they were always quiet, not emptily, but the full kind of quiet. The kind that means enough has been said. What Gideon Cross did on that stretch of Highway 2 was not complicated. He was behind a slow car on a wet road. He pulled alongside it. He looked. He pulled over. He did not calculate whether it was his business. He had already learned, in enough places where looking away cost things, that it was always your business. He simply did not drive past. This story is for every person who filed a report that no one noticed. For Pearl Hutchins, for every neighbor who noticed the truck, and for anyone who has ever pulled over in the rain without knowing yet what they were pulling over for. Is there a Walter in your life? A parent? A neighbor? Someone you've been meaning to check on before winter sets in? Tell me about them in the comments. I read every one. Let's fill this section with names worth remembering. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here when the next one comes. There are more stories to tell. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.